Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome today's speaker, who is Nathaniel Daw, who is a professor at Princeton. And Nathaniel is a pioneer in the area of reinforcement learning, and particularly in the application of concepts from reinforcement learning to human decision-making. And he has been working for a very long time in this area. He and I are kind of long-time collaborators and actually overlapped when we were at University College London for a while. And in particular, Nathaniel has worked a lot on the distinction between two different forms of reinforcement learning, model-based and model-free. He's going to probably tell us more about this and some extensions to this idea today. And that work has been highly influential and very hugely cited and a very widely adopted construct across the field. So it's actually kind of contributed a lot to kind of reframing our understanding of human decision-making. And so today, the talk is going to be Thinking the Right Thoughts. And why don't you take it from here, Nathaniel?
Thank you. Sorry, I was saying thank you so much for inviting me. And you would think on my 50th Zoom of the day and 6 billionth Zoom of the last year, I would know how to unmute myself by now, but no. And I want to thank you all particularly for coming because it's probably your 6 billionth Zoom as well, and I can't really imagine getting out of bed for it if I were you. So it's a great honor. What I'd like to do today is sort of really talk about work that jumps off of the work that John mentioned, and I'll really only spend a slide or so reviewing those ideas. And because this is a slightly short slot, I'm going to try to present really two studies, both of which are written up and you can read the details in, so I'll probably cut some corners to get through them. And we can talk about details afterwards as well. So backing up to sort of one of the questions that drives this work and these ideas about how does the brain do reinforcement learning? How does it solve hard problems? Why is that hard? And one of the things that makes it hard is that when you wander around the world taking actions, and I've chosen, for example, this video game, Montezuma's Revenge, which was famously too hard for the deep neural network to solve very well. The consequences of those actions occur sequentially in the world, and the value of them really depends, is delayed both in space and time, right? So if I'm this character and I'd have to decide whether to jump right or left, the value of jumping right arises because I can climb down this chain and jump over this skull and grab this thing, which I think is a gem, which is what actually earns me points. And that decoupling and sort of contingency of the consequences of actions is what makes solving these problems, particularly by trial and error, kind of figuring out what to do, extremely hard, right? So this is something called the problem of temporal credit assignment, or at least some part of it is. And it's obvious even just in the way that people in computer science and neuroscience have sort of framed these problems. So in computer science, we tend to imagine that the objective function of an agent solving a problem like this is not just is to choose according to maximizing some quantity, the value of some action in some situation, which is not just the reward, the points you're going to score immediately for that action, but the sum of the value of the next action and the next action as well. You're trying to aggregate, solve this, choose actions that will maximize this long-term return. And this equation implies a hard credit assignment problem because the value of Q, the value Q depends on things that happen later. So what I'd like to do today is present sort of two takes on this. One is a theoretical study which attempts to think about how the brain can choose in a context of mental simulation, which paths to consider in deciding what to do, and relating that to data on hippocampal place cells, or at least sort of stylized facts about hippocampal place cells. And the second thing is a newer study, which is an experiment that attempts to directly study the claims of this model in human data using MEG to decode replay of trajectories. Okay, so as John mentioned, and John himself has done important work on, there's an idea, there's an old idea, really goes back to Plato and before, that the brain sort of trades off different sort of discrete strategies for making choices, more deliberative and involving mental simulation of some sort in one sense, and on the other hand, more automatic or habitual type choice on the other. And these are studied a lot in the rodent, and they have resonance with things in behavioral economics, like system 1 and system 2 and so on. And one way to conceptualize this distinction is basically different strategies from artificial intelligence for computing this objective function and maximizing it in the context of trial and error behavior. So there's sort of two families of strategies that have gotten a lot of attention over the years, both historically and in current times in AI. One is known as model-based learning, and that involves solving this problem by sort of mental simulation. So I'm standing here at the beginning of the maze or a particular location in chess or something, and I need to think through different possible sequences of action I could take, adding up the rewards that I would obtain to literally compute this value through a sort of series of nested sums, which amounts to sort of searching through a large tree of possibilities. This is known as model-based reinforcement learning. It relies on sort of a one-step map of the sort of short-term consequences of actions that you can sort of string together to figure out what the value of longer-term sequences is. It's how, for instance, AlphaGo, the recent DeepMind AI for playing Go, works. In the brain, and this is something I'll talk about today, it's thought that perhaps a neural substrate for this type of operation, the sort of mental simulation of possible trajectories, is at least in the spatial domain, is trajectory, so-called trajectory replay in hippocampus, which we'll talk about. Now, this is clearly computationally very laborious, right? In fact, you can't necessarily explore the whole future tree of possible options in something like chess or Go, or even a maze. But it's quite flexible. So if you find yourself in a new chess position you've never been in before, or if your goal changes or the map changes or something, then you can sort of do computation to figure out what to do. So it's costly but efficacious. The other sort of end of the spectrum is a class of algorithms called model-free algorithms, which basically, rather than doing all this computation, learn the function, the long-run mapping from states and actions to long-run returns, more or less directly from experience, and then, or by caching the results of previous computations, and then just choose on that basis without going through the thinking again at decision time, for instance. And so this is the classic story of dopamine, temporal difference learning, going back to work by Wolfram Schultz and his collaborators in the 90s, Peter Dayan, Reid Montague. And it skips all the computational costs of mental simulation deliberation by just choosing actions by directly comparing estimates of long-term value at the cost of sort of inflexibility. So it can sort of choose the wrong actions, for instance, if the goals or the map change and these values are sort of out of date. For that reason, we and others have sort of associated this type of computation with things like habits and automaticity, and also compulsion in the case of sort of disordered behavior. And that's a sort of story I won't tell you today, but it's been a helpful way of thinking about this trade-off in the brain. And the other jumping off point sort of theoretically for all this was that once you've written things down this way, it gives you a handle on a sort of meta decision question, which is when should the brain deliberate and when should it act? And so again, in half a slide, one way that we and others have thought about this is that you could come up with a sort of resource rational or sort of meta optimal model of discretely switching between these two sort of modes of computation. So you a rat standing in a maze, and you could decide at this particular point, should I deliberate and really compute the values of all my different actions, or should I just act on the basis of my current habitual model free Q values. And that's a sort of speed accuracy trade-off, right? It's a trade-off of the sort of costs of spending time thinking against the benefits of sort of perhaps figuring out something better to do than you would have otherwise done. And John in particular has done neuroimaging of that trade-off. So this, without going into any details, this general way of framing the problem as a sort of optimization over decision approximate decision circuits or something, rational switching between two systems, explains a lot of data on when animals use habits versus when they don't. So for instance, I think we all know just from experience that actions become sort of habitual when they're sort of overtrained. This is also true in rat models. And that's predicted as sort of a rational trade-off in this type of model, that if you've done something over and over again because of stable contingencies, that it's really not worth thinking through on the 100th trial whether it's really what you want to do. You should sort of do it. At that point, you are not uncertain at all about the consequences. And this type of reasoning also has connections to things like exploration, information seeking. In the neuroeconomic world, I think it has relationships with rational attention and also with behavioral game theory. So things that Colin Cameron has done in the context of multiplayer games. The thing that I want to complicate today is the idea that this is a sort of two-system kind of all or nothing arbitration. So that echoes in some ways how this had been depicted in earlier rodent literature. And there really is evidence, some of it from John, that there are sort of separate neural circuits involved in these two types of computation. But at the same time, just for the purpose of thinking about how do you control deliberation in the brain, it's a rather extreme cartoon of it to say, either you're going to act right away or you're going to solve the problem completely and act optimally, and there's sort of nothing in between, right? So presumably a lot of the action, as indeed it is in things like chess and Go and so on, is deciding not just whether to deliberate, but which paths to think about. And in some sense, this finer grained question of which paths to think about is a generalization, or sort of subsumes the question of whether to think at all. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today, is still toy models, but toy models of that finer grained problem. Okay, so what do we know about this experimentally? So a sort of classic experiment that shows that animals can do this type of thing apparently goes back to Tolman and the so-called latent learning effect. So these are sort of multi-phase experiments where, say, a rat is exposed to a maze in a first phase without any particular incentives. He wanders around and nothing happens. In the second phase, he's taken out of the maze and placed in a particular point and shown that there's reward there. So he now has a sort of goal. In the third phase, he's pointed back at the beginning of the maze. And the question is, can he sort of head straight for the goal or not? So importantly, he didn't have the experience to directly follow the path that leads to the goal and be rewarded for it. So sort of simple kind of Hebbian model-free type circuits for directly learning which actions are rewarded can solve problems if they're presented that way. Instead, he has to sort of integrate the idea that there's cheese somewhere with knowledge of the map of the maze to decide what to do, right? If he's able to turn left at the beginning, and even rats can apparently do this. And that somehow requires some kind of integration of information, sort of computation to propagate information about the reward location to decisions about which actions to take at distal locations. So that's a case of this kind of distal non-local credit assignment. So the standard view of this, which I myself subscribe to, although I think it's probably oversimplified, is that what happens, how animals solve this task is that in phase one, they learn the sort of map of the world. In phase two, they sort of put the cheese on it. And in phase three, when they're put at the start of the maze, they can do sort of forward simulation of different possible paths and figure out the route to the cheese, and that will allow them to turn left. So that's sort of the standard model-based learning approach of this type of task. And indeed, there's a potential sort of very promising or seductive picture of what would be going on in the brain for this type of task in data from hippocampus. So of course, neurons from hippocampus famously are tuned for particular locations. So when an animal runs through a particular location, certain place cells that are tuned there light up, and then other ones fire when the animal runs through other locations. And through the ensemble of recording a lot of place cells, you can rodent physiologists can decode where the animal thinks he is pretty accurately. Maybe a little less famously, place cells also fire for locations where the animal isn't. So this is just one example of that. This is from a great study by Pfeiffer and Foster. And this is an animal who's actually standing still. He's in the context of this task where he has to sort of forage back and forth for food. The food is actually at this one sort of well, which is colored in turquoise. And his hippocampus in what's known as a sharp wave event actually appears to represent a whole series of locations in front of the animal in sequence very rapidly over the course of, as you can see, about 200 milliseconds. And I'm just showing the replaying that one event over and over again, but oftentimes a number of different things happen. And in this particular case, after this, the animal ran to this point where the food was. And in general, these happen and they tend to predict where the animal is going to go. So this type of so-called forward replay seems like a potential substrate for this type of world simulation, sort of mental simulation of the sort of map of the world, right? And actually, this is not, people sometimes think this in the hippocampal world, although there are a bunch of other theories about what this is for, and this is not necessarily the standard one. But if this were the case, that this were what it's doing, then it would really give us a different window onto how planning works in the brain at much more the microstructure level that I'd say that I want to look into. Which paths are you thinking about, in what order and when, right? So normally you don't have access to that from choices, but if we could, for the purpose of this talk, take seriously the idea that maybe this is what hippocampal place cells are doing when they do these trajectories, maybe we could learn something about how planning works that we wouldn't have known otherwise. So I think by looking at this, we can already learn a couple things actually under this hypothesis. One of them is that this replay is serial, right? It happens one path at a time. It's not a cone, it's not a sphere, right? It's really a path. And I think that's because the hippocampus is a tractor network. And so it can only represent one location at a time, and that constrains how you can compute over it, right? So that means that learning is a sort of serial search process, and that implies you really have to prioritize it, right? You can't just plan every possible path at the same time in parallel. The other thing is that this happens, this phenomena of sharp waves at least, happen only when the animal is standing still. When he's running, the place cells predominantly represent where he is. And so that implies, again, this kind of opportunity cost where there's a trade-off between thinking and acting. So animals can stop and run simulations, or they can run and use their hippocampus to keep track of where they are, but they can't do both at the same time, evidently. And another thing we can intuit from this, which is the weirdest part, is that one of the reasons that people in the hippocampal world don't necessarily think this is for planning is that what I've shown you is just one case of a larger phenomenon. And when I first talked to my friend Lauren Frank, who actually works on this issue, he said that's all hogwash because actually place cells rewind backwards behind the animal just as much as they go forward. So it can't possibly be about planning. So indeed, in general, there's lots of different patterns of hippocampal replay, these non-local trajectories, some in front of the animal, some behind the animal, like backwards, some forward or backwards in other places where the animal isn't. And so this specific case, at least where you're sitting at the start of a maze and thinking about where to go, it's got to be at least more general than that. So part of what we're going to do today is try to understand more generally how these patterns of sequential replay could support something like model-based learning more generally. And we're going to do that by sort of coming up with a sort of new toy theory of sort of what to think about and when. And this is really work by Marcelo Matar when he was in my lab. Okay, so the first thing to do is to come back to the type of experiment and realize that if your problem is non-local credit assignment, that is connecting actions to outcomes over space, because it's the separation between those that makes it difficult to compute the value function, then there's nothing particularly special about starting somewhere and running a path forward. It would be perfectly fine, for instance, to imagine a situation where I get to the cheese and I'm like, hey, there's cheese here. How could I get here? And think backwards to all the places I could have come from, right? That would solve exactly the same problem just as well with kind of a different series of neural operations. I could also find the cheese and then take a nap and start dreaming about different routes I could take and push cheese around the map that way as well. So in general, these coherent trajectories are useful for propagating information about value around mazes, whether or not you actually do them forward at choice time, as people had sort of assumed. And there's some evidence from the human fMRI literature, some of which I've been involved with, some of which not, that actually shows that people can solve problems like this. It seems to be associated not just with sort of forward, it's hard to say the word replay about fMRI, but sort of activation at choice time, or backward activation at reward time, or activation during rest in between. All those things seem to help people do sort of credit assignment. And again, I think the fact that it's not just the fact that you can think about all the paths in front of you, but you can think of all the other paths in the world, not just in this maze, but other mazes you could be in while you're sleeping, again, suggests that selection and prioritization is a real issue here. Okay, so here's our model in a nutshell. We're going to start with a sort of element of computation, which is the so-called Bellman backup. So the idea is we're going to take some state in action, and we're going to, so here I'm at here and going to here, and we're going to push the value of the successor state related to that and any rewards I would have gotten along the way from one to the other. And so that's a sort of morsel of reinforcement learning. It comes from the so-called Bellman equation, and most RL algorithms sort of based on iterations of this basic operation. So in particular, the standard temporal difference story learning of dopamine and prediction errors says that dopamine does exactly this along the paths the animal actually follows. It backs up value one step at a time as the animal walks through states. But you can also build sort of planning algorithms, even sort of standard ones, by doing this operation over sort of simulated or replayed experiences. So instead of feeding my dopamine system where I actually am and the trajectories actually follow, if I feed it trajectories I could have taken, it can push reward along those as well, using basically the same circuitry in theory. And so then the question becomes, if you want to set things up that way, at which states and actions should I perform these backups and in what order, right? So the proposal that Marcelo made was that what we want to do is come up with a rational theory of this. We want to define what would be the most useful square to think about of all squares in the maze next. So he calls that the expected value of backup, which is the utility of any particular computational operation. And I'll explain where that comes from in the next slide. So the expected value of backup in a particular location of some particular action is defined as how much future discounted cumulative reward, how much more Q value will I earn following doing that operation compared to if I didn't. So we're going to repeatedly optimize this one step at a time in a sort of greedy sense. What's the best thing to think about now? What's the best thing about thinking about next? We're not taking into account the fact that thinking sets up more thinking, although that's somewhat implicit in how it ends up solving the problem. So like most kind of utilities, you can break EVB, it turns out, into the product of a sort of probability times a magnitude, just like Kahneman-Tversky type expected value, right? So in this case, the probability term is what we're calling need due to earlier work in the human memory literature, says how likely am I to visit this state soon? So thinking about a state is only useful, only changes my action there. And so if anywhere. And so it can only serve me in terms of future reward gathering if I actually visit the state I dreamed about, right? So if I plan about some state, how likely am I to get there? So there's a quantity called the successor representation or expected discounted future occupancy. So this is how soon and how often am I going to visit this state in the future, thereby harvesting the value of my thinking. And then how much I earn if I do get there is what we call gain. So we just define this literally as If I do some thinking, it might change my mind and help me choose a different action. If it does help me choose a different action, then that action could be worth more than the other one, or I wouldn't have chosen it. And the spread between those two things is the gain. So if I made it there, how much more would I earn if I chose a better action? So for the purpose of what I'm going to talk about today, we just compute this completely unrealistically, assuming we actually did the computation and just seeing which computations are the best. So actually comparing before and after the backup. Clearly, that's not a process level serious account for how the brain can decide which computations to do, because it assumes you already know the outcome of those computations, and we're not selling it as such. It helps us understand what the properties of optimal scheduling are, and also I think it leads directly to more tractable, realizable approximations to this that we could talk about if you want, but this is sort of good enough for our purposes today. And what's the beautiful piece theoretically of this paper is that Marcelo was able to sort of prove a theorem showing that you could express the EVB as the product of these two terms. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to go back to the hippocampal place cell literature and understand the regularities of when, and there's a sort of decade of this stuff, when different patterns of replay occur according to these sort of toy principles, need and gain. And the first thing to notice is that the product of need and gain is sort of pushing two ways. So we said that replay goes forward and backwards, and it turns out need basically pushes it forward and gain pushes it backwards. So one way to see that is my expected discounted future occupancy of states, need. Need is going to be sort of proportional to places I'm going to visit soon in the future or likely to. And so it tends to predict or favor forward replay of trajectories that are likely to come soon. So if I'm in a world where I tend to run this route, then my need really runs along this route as well. And things that are closer I have more need for, right? And so what you get out of the model is indeed sequences that follow sort of paths forward in cases where need dominates. And it turns out that because of the way the Bellman equation works, gain flows backwards. So imagine everything's in equilibrium. I come to the end of a maze and I find cheese for the first time. That teaches me something about where I am. It says that if I make one step forward, I can get the cheese. That's sort of normal experiential learning. But that also means that there's a special consequence for exactly one state in action in the map in terms of gain. There's one state in action in the map where if I push one step forward, I can get from there to where I know there's value and propagate information backwards. And so gain says every time you find changes in reward, you want to push those backwards to places you could have come from. That's where gain is. And once you've done that, that is recursively true of the state before that and the states before that, and so on. And you again get backward sequences in cases where gain dominates. And then the extent to which you get forward or backward sequences depends on the circumstances, like whether you just discovered a reward or not. So that's the theory. And I'm not, for the purposes of this talk, going to go through a bunch of details about all the data that explains the hippocampal literature. It explains a lot, although these aren't really the right experiments to test this theory. So for instance, just to give you a flavor, there's sort of famous data, it's been shown many times, that you tend to get forward replay at the beginning of sort of a trial or a run, and backward replay at the end when the animal sort of gets the reward at the end. And for the reasons I just said, need and gain dominate in those two different circumstances. And so you actually get, the model reproduces that basic sort of circumstantial specialization of forward versus backward replay, even though they're really doing the same thing, right? It's not like forward replay and backward replay are doing different things. They're just more useful in different circumstances. Another example is that you might think that surprise always triggers replay on this kind of irrational model, that if you find something out, you need to propagate it around. It turns out that actually, some surprises, some learning isn't actionable. It doesn't change your actions at predecessor states. And if it doesn't, then there's no gain for it. And so for instance, there's a famous example from David Foster's lab where animals who are positively surprised by reward, who are shuttling on a track, do backward replay, but negative surprise doesn't make them do backward replay. And one reason for that is that not getting rewards you expected actually doesn't change the fact that you're still shuttling on a maze. You still have to run back and get the reward on the other side anyway. So there's no gain in that circumstance. On the other hand, there's circumstances like getting shocked, where that actually teaches you something you can do. You can avoid the shocked location in the future. And in that case, you really do, although it's another negative surprise, you get lots of replay, and our model can predict that. Our model can also predict regularities about replay that occurs during sleep, like about which paths get replayed and what consequences that has for behavior when the animal wakes up. So that's a very quick sketch of the theory. And let me just sort of summarize the theoretical part of the talk then. And again, you could read the paper. We're trying to look at hippocampal replay as a new data window into how the brain computes value and into finer grained dynamics of mental simulation that we otherwise wouldn't have access to. And from the perspective of thinking about place cells, this gives us sort of a unified functional account of sort of 10 years of weird phenomena about how place cells do some things in some situations and other things in other situations. But from the perspective of decision neuroscience, this gives us a new and kind of more granular model of how choice computation works in the brain, and in particular, how it's sort of rationally steered. And in terms of this ideas about habits and compulsion and trading off model-based and model-free, it sort of generalizes this sort of relatively crude distinction between think or don't think, and if you don't think, you do dumb things like take drugs, to a much more kind of nuanced, kind of positive account of in which circumstances do you tend to think about which things, and it gives you insights not just into sort of dumb behaviors like compulsive drug taking, but things like craving or rumination or obsession. So I think there's a lot of kind of computational psychiatry we can do with these ideas as well. The other thing, and what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about, is that these weren't the right experiments. So most hippocampal place cell experiments aren't really sort of trial and error credit assignment tasks. And so they don't really provide much opportunity to really test the meat of this theory. But there's real opportunities now because we have a sort of prediction of a whole sequence of things that should be related to one another. The animal should have a series of experiences that should promote need and gain, cause certain paths to be replayed. That should push value around the animal's Q values, which would change his choices on subsequent trials. So by sort of not monitoring or manipulating at each step of this sort of hypothetical progression, we think that it should be possible to really test this idea in rodent experiments and see to what extent these relationships hold. And so we're trying to get rodent people to do that. In the meantime, I'm going to show you a human experiment that at least gives you a feel. Clearly with humans, we don't have the same power to decode individual trajectories and so on, but to give you a feel of the kind of experiment that we're sort of trying to sell to the rodent people as well. And we are very slowly making progress in that. So in the meantime, what Marcelo and I did is team up with Yun-Se Liu, who had been working with Tim Behrens and Ray Dolan using MEG in humans to decode sequences of sort of replayed activity in people. And he'd done he has a theoretical paper about, or a data analysis paper about this, and a number of experimental papers using this with different task paradigms. So we wanted to apply it to the credit assignment reinforcement learning problem. And what I'd like to do, I think I have about, where do we start? It's about 10, 13 minutes. I should be able to make it through, is ask 3 questions, which sort of are similar to the steps of the arrows on the previous slide. So one question is whether replayed trajectories, at least as we monitor them in people now, actually support pushing value around, sort of non-local credit assignment. And so we're going to ask that by asking, do people learn more about paths that they replay compared to paths that they don't? And then the question is this prioritization account of this procedure have any merit? So behaviorally, do people learn more about certain paths than others, ones that have higher gain and need in Marcelo's theory? And neurally, does the replay preferentially cluster on those trajectories. So one way of depicting all this is a sort of a triangle where you have priority, need and gain, driving replay, and driving choices, hypothetically, and we can sort of test each of the arms of this triangle. And what I'm going to try to do, well, cutting many corners, is show you data related to predictions in each arm of this triangle. Okay, so here's the task. So this is not explicitly a spatial task. It sequences of visual images, and that's because what you can decode in human MEG is from sort of is categories of visual images. And so, but it's high speed, so we have some ability to see replay that we wouldn't see with MRI. So at each trial, people start in one of three, what we call them states, the orange, green, or the blue. And then they get sort of two, you can think of them as tunnels, although they're not spatial to choose between. They can choose one stimulus or another. That produces a sequence of stimuli ending in an end state where they get a reward. And the trick is, if you should call it a trick, is that the end states are shared between the three start states. So there's one tunnel that leads to X in orange, and there's one tunnel that leads to X in blue, and there's one tunnel that leads to X in green, and similar for Y. And so what that means is, if I choose the C tunnel, I go down here to X and I get paid for it, I can directly learn about the value of C, but that also has consequences for future choices I might make at the green state or the blue state that would tell me about the choice of A and the choice of E. That is sort of fundamentally non-local, right? That's someplace, I'm not at that state, I haven't taken that action. In order to push the information about X back to green, I'm going to have to use some kind of sequential replay, is the sort of theory here. And in general, we set this up so that these paths differ in need and gain. So for instance, these different start states occur with different probability. So one of them is the most common, and so it's higher need than the others. And one of them occurs least common, so it's lower need because you're less likely to visit it again. Gain is a sort of function of what people know about different states, which depends on the choices they've taken and so on. So that's less, that's something we estimate rather than manipulate. So first of all, to see that the behavior is working, we can ask, do people learn about the local and non-local paths? So we can see in terms of, we can just quantify win, stay, lose, shift. If someone makes a choice like C and gets rewarded for it versus not rewarded for it, if I were to start back again on the next trial in the orange state, people are more likely to choose C again if they were rewarded than if they were non-rewarded. So they propagate the outcome information to affect their next choice at the same state. That's regular local learning. You can do that easily with temporal difference learning or something. But it's also the case that actually to almost the same degree, people are able to carry that information over to the other state. So if I was rewarded on the orange state for choosing X, and then I put you in the blue state, people are more likely to choose A than B if they were rewarded than if they were not rewarded. So they're able to produce non-local sort of credit assignment as well as local. So we can ask the first question by sort of taking this apart. Is more of this non-local propagation happening for higher priority paths? And the way we actually do this is not just by plotting sort of one step, win, stay, lose, shift, but fitting a full learning model that averages prediction errors over time and so on, the usual kind of Q-learning model, but allowing non-local paths to be updated as well as local paths. And there's a separate sort of step size constant that it estimates. So it says you run down a path, you get rewarded, you update the local path with some learning rate, and you update the non-local paths with some other learning rate. We can then estimate what is that learning rate, and is it different between high and low probability paths? And it is. So the prediction is that you should have a sort of higher priority paths, and we do this separately for need and for gain. Only gain is actually significant. We estimate a higher step size. The information you get at the outcome has a bigger impact for a high priority state than a low priority state. And these always come in pairs. So this is a nice sort of balanced test. There's always 2 on every trial. One's higher priority and one's lower priority. Okay, so people seem to learn more about the higher priority paths, just assessed behaviorally. Now we can do replay. So, this is human MEG, right? This is not place cell replay, so I don't want to oversell it. But each state corresponds to visual objects, and so we have, I forget, 17 of them or something, and we can train a classifier to decode them, and it actually does pretty well. It doesn't do so well and the data aren't so clean that you can individually decode a particular trajectory. But what you can do is you can average sort of the amount of strength of what Yunse calls sequenceness occurring at different times and in different directions and paths and so on. So a priori, we actually don't know whether replay would be going forward or backwards, or when it is, when it started, what speed it is. And so what Yunse's method does, and again, he has a whole paper about this and has done a bunch of studies with it, and it works, is he uses a big GLM to try to explain the patterns of classifier behavior, of sort of representation of visual images in the brain in terms of sequential activity that could potentially be occurring at different speeds and also forward or backwards over different pairwise transitions in this sort of graph. And what he gets out of this in the first instance is curves that look like this. So this is replay at the end of the trial. 0 is when the subject gets the reward, or sorry, 0 is the lag, but we're looking at a period right after the subject gets the reward. And then this is the strength of different types of replay for forward sequences and backward sequences as a function of the lag between states. So what we see is a motivating example is that during this time, sometimes you see representation of some stimulus preceded by the preceding stimulus, preceded by the preceding stimulus, you sort of slow backward replay. Later on, you might see slow backward replay of another path. And separately, you also see fast forward replay of the path you came from. So this is a trial when the subject came from A1, A23, and there's fast forward replay. Now, this gives the impression that we're decoding individual events, and this is just a sort of example best trial. What we're actually measuring is the aggregate strength of these different categories of replay, but you can see slow backward and fast forward. That's what this shows. So there's significant strength of sequences, very rapid replay of forward sequences, very slow replay of backward sequences. And if you further take them apart at this latency, you ask, is it the path you came from versus the other one? It's the local path. So that's the one that we probably don't care about for the purposes of non-local learning. The slow replay tends preferentially to activate the non-local path. So it's backward replaying places I could have come from at this speed at the time of reward. I'll just tell you, we didn't find anything much interesting at the start of the trial. So it doesn't seem like there's any action in this particular task in terms of sort of forward replay at choice time. It seems like things are going on in the brain at outcome time. And specifically, they're going on in this 160 millisecond replay. That's our sort of hypothesis. So now we can look at this and ask, we can plug this into our behavioral model, right? And say, do we do a better job updating choices for paths that are replayed versus paths that aren't? And the answer is, again, yes. So when we can significantly detect replay, this is relatively rare, right? So because the replay is noisy and sparse, but when we can significantly detect replay compared to when we can't, for the paths where we can detect the replay, the learning rate is higher than the paths where it isn't. So again, there's better value propagation. And this is true for the 160 millisecond path, but not, so replay, the one we think is involved, but not for the other one, which would make sense because it's not even conveying the right content. So that's the connection between replay and choices. the last question, and then I'm done and it's time for the fireside chat, is the prioritization of the neural replay. So we can ask this, for this 160 millisecond backward replay, does it occur more for the higher priority, the lower high priority path on each trial? And the answer is yes, it does. And again, this is not true with the 30 millisecond replay. It is true with 160 millisecond replay. There is more backward replay for the higher priority path in the sense of need times gain. Okay, so that was a sort of quick overview of what I think is an exciting result. And I'm part of what I'm excited about is I think that doing this with really trajectory by trajectory precision in rodents would be really exciting. But I think this is already pointing in the right direction. This is, I think, some of the best support for the long-standing proposal that Marcelo and I picked up on in the theoretical paper, but goes back longer, that these non-local sequences support mental simulation or non-local credit assignment. We really see that people learn more about the paths they replay. So, or at least we have evidence, it's not causal, but for an association. And we also have evidence for the second class of questions, which is the prioritization question. So both behaviorally and neurally, people learn more and replay more the sort of high priority paths. And this is sort of consistent with the more specific predictions of the model I talked about. So in the future, we're interested in both taking this into rodents in the spatial domain, and again, also thinking about patients. So if things like rumination or worry or hallucination can be thought of as abnormalities in mental simulation, basically, that should have consequences both for what's happening in the brain and for behavior in these kinds of tasks. And we have some suggestive results about this already, but I think that's a real potential for future work. So again, I'd like to thank my collaborators, Marcelo, who did all the theoretical work. Yunse and Marcelo collaborated on the MEG experiment, and Ray and Tim helped, have worked with Yunse for a very long time on all of those experiments and were involved in the MEG experiment. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Nathaniel, for a wonderful talk. So I think now is the time to open up for the any questions for the fireside chat. I guess let me just see. So if you would like to ask a question, if you can go into the, I think it's the reactions usually, and you should see a raise hand. So please do that. I can see that there are some raised hands now. So I'm going to go to the first raised hand I see, which is Nishit Patel. So could you please ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Nathaniel, for that wonderful talk. I really like your work. But one of the things that I've thought about after reading your work was that the prioritization in your case, the work that you did with Marcelo, works only during learning and not once the animal has learned. So once there's something where you do not make a change in your policy, once there's things that do not make a change in the policy, you don't, your model should predict that there's no replay forward or backward whatsoever. I'm sure you're aware of this, but are you thinking of ways in which to resolve this, or do you think that humans and animals would also not replay forward or backward sequences after at steady state?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think, and it's of course complicated. So one of the things that we talk about in the paper is there are apparently contradictory claims in the rodent literature about what happens to replay with overtraining. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to completely reproduce this from memory, but I think one thing that happens is it gets more focused. So along paths the animal tends to take, it gets more concentrated. You might measure more replay, but you measure less replay in general. So there are changes in both the overall occurrence of replay, which we think of as being related to gain, the dynamics of gain over learning, and also the distribution of replay, which we think of as related to need with learning. So that's getting towards the kind of thing you're talking about. Now, the the strong claim that it should disappear completely because there's no gain once everything equilibrates is a completely fair point, and I think it's probably not true even just by introspection that's going to be true in the brain. But of course, we have to allow for the possibility of change, right? So we're, two things. One is that presumably gain is not computed, unlike the way we simulate it. It has to be estimated or approximated. And so whatever the heuristic is for gain is not necessarily going to zero in that situation. And there's a possibility of change, right? And so you need to allow for some uncertainty and some value of deliberation or exploration, mental exploration, even in the steady state. And so I think those two things together in a more complicated model would help to resolve that.
Thanks.
Great. So the next comment or question is from Akil Fenneman.
Hello. Very, very interesting topic. Thank you very much. I really like the rationalist approach of this research. One thing I did have as a question is somewhat in terms of, let's say, causality. To what degree in some degree, this assumes that the searching process, this spatial navigation process, is under some form of active control. I can steer the replay. I can make sure the replay goes into a profitable direction, right? And to what degree could it also be that replay is somewhat of an involuntary response that sort of just happens in the brain when I see this stuff, and then sort of leads and causes the actual decision itself?
So there might be a couple different questions there. So I mean, voluntary versus involuntary. We're not necessarily assuming that. I don't think this is what you're implying, but just to be clear, that the rat literally decides what to decide, right? That presumably there's some rational control of trajectories in the brain that are
Of course.
But and then there's the question. There's two causality questions, right? There's the causality question of why it goes where it goes, why paths that tend to be, have high need and gain are replay. That's one causality question. Another causality question is that causal in changing the animal's behavior? So actually, in a sense, two of the arrows on my chart, I only showed you associational data for them. Both of them need causal data. What do I have to say about that? I mean, we don't really know, right? There are experiments, particularly from Lauren Frank, doing things like interrupting sharp waves. So there's a sort of, they have a closed loop system where a rat's running, and when they detect that these events are happening, they stimulate in some way and they knock them out. And that definitely messes up the animal's behavior. They haven't quite done it with the types of tasks we'd like to use to test the kinds of things you're talking about. So that's more the second type of prioritization. So I think if we're working with Lauren to deploy that technology with tasks that actually involve credit assignment to see if you can ask the causal question, does replaying a path, does interrupting replay of a path interrupt credit assignment, let's say. Prioritization, I think I have which seems to be part of what you're interested in. I don't think we know much about I don't think we have good, to be honest, sort of circuity ideas. What is driving the replay in hippocampus? What's steering it? I mean, something must be steering it, right? It's patterned. But I don't think we know enough about what it is to even talk about doing a causal experiment on it. It's a great question. But I think the problem goes further than is it causal. It's like, how could this work? Like what information has to converge on the map to drive things around the right way? And that's a great question that someone should work on, even just theoretically.
Yeah, exactly. All right, and then one, sort of related follow-up question there. Like, so ideally you would want to create or cause a sharp wave ripple. Mm-hmm. Is there any way that you know if like that's theoretical, experimentally possible?
I'm trying to remember. I feel like Lauren has ideas about that, and maybe even first of all, I'm not sure if they're secret or not. But since I'm telling it to 300 people, my sense is that Lauren has ideas about that. I can't remember enough to give away any of them anyway. I don't believe anything like that's been published, although I'd be happy to know. I mean, there is work now it's a slightly different area, but there's a lot of work on sort of 2-photon high speed stimulation and stuff. So you could almost imagine producing sequences, but getting them at the right speed and whether they're accompanied by all the other things, so it probably isn't within technology. Yeah.
I'll keep my eyes open.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the next one on my list is Doug Lee.
Nathaniel, do you mind closing the sharing?
Oh, sure. Happy to.
Hi, so thanks a lot for the talk. It was really interesting. I just wanted to ask a couple of quick clarifications, or maybe not so quick, it's up to you, about some of the terms you used. So I'll start off with when you were showing us the human MEG results and you were referring to mental simulation in general. In your mind, do you separate mental simulations that are more deliberative versus those that are automatic? Because what you showed is clearly on the order of like 100 milliseconds. Whereas, when we think of, model-based reinforcement learning, we might think of more like active deliberation that would be on the order of a few seconds. And so I guess, do you view those as inherently different things?
That's a great question. I do think that there are probably multiple mechanisms. Clearly I can reason linguistically about what if I do this, what if I do this, what if I do this, and that the little voice in my head happens at a different speed than other things. It's also clear that the rodent activity happens really fast, faster than that. And then there's the sort of, or somewhat orthogonal to that, although maybe not completely orthogonal, is the question of, are you conscious of it or something, right? Is it, and I have almost nothing to say about that, right? The computational distinctions don't turn on whether you know what's happening or not. So clearly there are things, again, that I do in my head that I know are happening, and there are things I don't know are happening. I think the hippocampal world, more the hippocampal memory world in humans than the hippocampal spatial world, has strong opinions about hippocampal activity, the things hippocampus is involved in, which are supposed to be more deliberative and more conscious. I think the evidence for that is actually pretty weak. And there are lots of these sort of classic hippocampal effects like transitive inference and sensory preconditioning and stuff that people are actually not aware of. And if you ask them, they don't realize they're doing it, even though it's hippocampal, supposedly. So, but yes, I mean, I take all those points.
Okay, and I also wanted to clarify, if I may, your need and gain terms from the first part of your talk.
Yep.
So I found it a little confusing when you present need and gain as fully separable. With respect to the need as being like the probability of ending up in a certain state, as you presented it, it seems that like inherently includes the reward history. Like you're not purely showing a map that's based on the structural limitation of the environment. You're showing, because you know the path to the reward, this happens to end up as the most likely state that you're going to traverse through, but that still includes a reward component. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, that's actually a super deep point also. We have a whole other paper and a whole other theory that's sort of somewhat a theory about this. But let's see, in brief, the way we're conceptualizing need in this work is it's based on historical trajectories. So it's true that on the one hand, there's a sort of connectivity of the environment that's maybe unbiased, and maybe before you've experienced anything in the environment, need would flow in an unbiased way. But as you learn that you tend to follow certain paths, empirically need follows those paths also, and that's influenced by reward as well, and in the sort of complex snake eating its tail kind of way through the choices you make and so on. And that indeed I think I mentioned before, is something we think happens in place cells, right? They tend to start focusing on trajectories as the animal follows those trajectories, even if those are sort of sparse in the space of things you could be doing in the world. There's a super subtle thing about planning, which is that sometimes what you need replay to do is teach you new trajectories that you wouldn't otherwise tend to take. And another way of saying that is that the need that would result after a replay is different from the need that would result before the replay. And this is the kind of thing that, because we're using a greedy approximation, we're not directly handling here. But we have another theoretical paper by Pai and Pire that's kind of all about this problem of how do you anticipate trajectories when those trajectories are actually themselves going to be changing. But that's kind of a long story.
Okay, I'll ask my last question later because I don't want to ask people waste too much time.
Thank you, Doug. So the next person up is Homero Esmeralda.
Yeah, hello, thank you very much. Very, very nice talk. Can you comment a little bit on what do you think, like if you think that theta sequences that happen, particularly in a choice point or even when you are returning from an error, if you also, like, what do you think if you think they are governed by the same rational theory, would they also be, yeah, what's your...
So your theta sequences. So yeah, one thing I elided, I think this is, tell me if this is not your question. So in the hippocampal world, there are actually two sets of phenomena which are separate. So, and they're related to different patterns of the EEG. So while an animal is running, you see this theta 8 hertz oscillation in the EEG, and that's associated with, also with, although it's, you know, famously, while the animal's running, the place cells where he is are lighting up. There's actually sequential activity during those 8 hertz cycles, running a little bit ahead and even a little bit behind, mostly ahead of the animal. So the place cells are lighting up sequentially back and forth, and it's the position in the brain is cycling back and forth around near the animal's location. And when the animal comes to a T junction, it goes left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, alternating at least sometimes, at least in Lauren Frank's hands. That's separate from the events that I was talking about today, which are sharp wave ripples, which is when the animal is standing still and there's these more extended trajectories. Both of them are pretty promising in terms of potential neural substrates for credit assignment or planning or whatever you want to call it. The reason we focused in this work on the sharp waves mainly is because they're longer. So my bet is that they're sort of if you were going to choose one of them as being the thing that's doing this, it's that. It's striking that this cycling that the theta sequences do at T junctions. That certainly looks like, David Reddish has also made a point that this looks like, trial and error, kind of vicarious trial and error, but it doesn't go very far. Like it's not clear that it's sort of doing the work in terms of thinking about all the way to the reward. And so it doesn't strike me as plausible that's really going to solve the problem of figuring out what's the outcome of this action, because it just doesn't physically run far enough in space, usually, as far as I can tell. I think David would disagree with this, but that's my take. My guess is that it's probably more involved in sort of filtering on where am I. So I'm trying to figure out where I am currently, and that in like a common filter, you think about your GPS when you make a wrong turn, it sort of still thinks you're going where you're going. That involves a projection step. And so I think that theta sequencing is probably more about future projection just for the purpose of tracking, not for the purpose of credit assignment. That's just my guess.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the next question is Harrison Ritz.
Hey, Harrison.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. I wanted to I'll give you a little extra time in the Q&A to talk about what you mentioned when you were mentioning the gain equations, about realistic versions of this that don't assume you already know pi nu.
Now I have to deliver on that. So let's see. So the first thing to say, let's see. So there is an old idea in computer science, which goes back to the 80s, I think, called prioritized sweeping. So to some extent, it's, I think, still alive as sort of the primary idea for how to do this in this sort of modern deep RL world. But the basic idea is when you pass through a state, you're keeping track of states where you encounter big prediction errors. The predecessors of those states are ones where you should do some learning. So prioritized sweeping usually just sorts on that. And then when you have time to think, it sort of indiscriminately pushes backward information about rewards. So that's actually pretty similar to our gain, right? So that's a heuristic, the sort of absolute Bellman residual, absolute prediction error already is a pretty, together with one step of backward, what connects to this, is a sort of proxy for gain. So what we're adding to that is a couple of things. One is the need, right? So you don't necessarily, not all those prediction errors are worth doing. You want to multiply that by need. That's easy. The other thing that's tricky is many of these explanations, I mentioned a little bit, positive and negative prediction errors having different effects and actionable and non-actionable. The details of gain in terms of whether it actually changes your mind or could change your mind depend on, so good surprises, positive prediction errors and negative prediction errors affect different actions that come before them. And I think that asymmetry is actually really important, and there's evidence, that explains features of the data. So positive prediction errors tell you there's something I could get here. So actions that you wouldn't have otherwise favored are the ones that have gain from that, because it could teach you, now I should do this. Negative prediction errors tells you these are bad things, you shouldn't do it. Actions you would have taken are the ones that have high gain, because you can learn not to do them. And so there's this sort of interaction between the sign of the replay and the nature of the action you're thinking about at the predecessor state. And so I think you can imagine augmented heuristics that take into account that sort of sign flip, and they'd have to have a sort of pre-synaptic and a post-synaptic sort of component, like a part that's related to the predecessor state and the part that's related to the successor state. But still kind of be locally computable without assuming you knew the outcome. Just sort of, these two guys are pushing in two directions, and if they have the same sign, then you replay, and if not, then not, or whatever. So that's the kind of thing we have in mind. That's a little bit hand wavy, but it sort of grows out of elaborated prioritized sweeping.
No, but I like a kind of Pierce Hall backup. I think that's cool.
Great, thank you. So next up is Antonio, and then Brian. Antonio first.
Brian, you were first.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Brian.
Anyway, I think this belies my ignorance of the literature as it stands now. But by the way, that state operationalization is cool, and the Meg study with the pictures. But I assume this is a sub question, but you're localizing like ventral stream visual types of events. Is that?
Well, so this is presumably, but this is MEG, right? So it's actually all done in sensor space, and it's all done whole sensor, as far as I know. The methods are definitely, you can say, in Tim's purview, but unlike fMRI, where we definitely, as I'm sure you know, focus on ventral visual cortex, which is presumably where this is coming from. I agree.
So that's a
segue. Don't do that
explicitly.
To
my fMRI question, which is, what do you think is driving the forward versus reverse replay? Is it the same neural circuit, or are there different circuits? For instance, might MPFC be driving reverse and nucleus accumbens or something more subcortical be driving forward?
Yeah,
and it's just too crazy. Don't answer. You could just punt on this, but I'm just throwing it out as an idea that could be looked at. If somebody
so I mean, there's a couple different things, right? So one is clearly, again, the example of MVPA and house cortex is a good example. Whatever we're looking at is sort of an epiphenomenon, in the sense that it's, presumably, let's say, for argument's sake, hippocampus is running the real sequence, and it's evoking all this category-related activity in other parts of the brain, and that's what we're happy to be able to read out with fMRI, right? So there's a sort of difference between the source of the decoded sequence and the generator of the decoded sequence. And then there's the possibility, as you say, that they could be two different things. Both of them could be two different things, but at least the generators could definitely be different, given they have very different timescales. If you do so, and then the problem with MEG is that the source localization question is not, I think, seriously solvable. But if you run the standard source localization on these results, they could somehow do this separately for the different patterns of replay. They claim that they're getting the 30, and the caveats are immense here, right? But hippocampus shows up for the slow forward replay, the fast forward replay, and outside hippocampus, but I think still temporal, shows up for the fast backward replay, which is sort of not what we would have expected, obviously, but that's what it says for what it's worth. And again, I don't think it's maybe worth a lot, but that's what we've got on that question.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is 160 milliseconds is basically theta. So that's also weird because we're expecting sharp waves, but they're at theta frequency. And they're not associated with spindles or other EEG things. So, but that's what we find.
Cool. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So, Antonio.
Oh, you're muted, Antonio.
I just want to, I really love this stuff. I have a question with the purpose of brainstorming, especially since there are many students in the call. So as I understand this, there is a component of lock-in in the way you explore and you learn, because you start replaying and you can experience in only paths that you have experienced. It's not that you sit down and cognitively construct paths. You start learning some paths and you start replaying them more and they become kind of self-reinforced of lock-in. And would it be fair to say that this suggests that through the right path of training, when I change situations, I can get you to carry out very serious mistakes because you are much more likely, for example, if I have a maze and you have learned some trajectories, and then I change the situation of the maze so that instead of running up, you should be running down. But you have learned to activate and consider these paths, but not any other paths. Then I get you locked in, and I can potentially train you to do some serious crazy stuff. Because now you don't explore everything. You have a serious bias to think about some things than others. Have you guys thought about this at all? Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. I think we've done this study. So it's related to a different set of theories, but it's a great question. So there's a whole other set of ideas about, which is not completely unrelated. I also mentioned Payam Pire's paper, which is somewhat related to this too. Let's see if I can, how quickly I can go through all this. So you're exactly right. Another way of stating, a different way of stating one of the problems with forward simulation or whatever it is with credit assignment is that what you do now depends on what you're going to do next time, depends on what you're going to do next time, and depends on what you're going to do next time. And if I want to do something, everybody thinks that you have kind of long run representations of sequences of things in the brain that capture regularities in those sequences, that it's sort of a temporal abstraction or something, options and all kinds of function approximation. People think grid cells represent kind of lower frequency bases for representing predictions over space or something. The problem is exactly what you said, right? And the successor representation is the version that we happen to have worked with. Is a particular RL method that uses temporal abstraction to learn multi-state predictions instead of single-state predictions, and so you don't have to string them together. The problem is it gets exactly like you said, locked in to paths you used to like to take. And if your goals change, the whole reason you need to replan, or the whole value of changing my choice now, is that it also changes my choice. My choice changes later. And if it doesn't, it won't help. And so you actually can fool people. Exactly the logic you said. We have a Nature of Human Behavior paper. Ida Momenijad is the first author, which you get people to learn a sort of, I think it's a sort of binary tree of a sequence of two choices followed by two choices or something. And then you move rewards around underneath to places you wouldn't have chosen at the second level, and you put them back at the first level and ask them what do they want to do, and they sort of miss opportunities, presumably because of that. And Evan Rustick has a follow-up fMRI paper using categorical state decoding to try to argue that is indeed what's happening in that situation.
One very quick follow-up, just for the purpose of brainstorming with anyone. So you would imagine with this problem, there is kind of a meta optimality principle that you may want to explore sometimes and deviate from your paths. Not a whole new path, but do you have a sense, or have you guys thought at all of, if you were going to do some kind of trembling for exploring along your paths, how do you want to do it with optimally? Do you just tremble at one point, or you don't tremble a whole new path? It's something that you guys have thought in other contexts a lot. That's why I was curious.
So I think this is a super hard question, right? And I think I'm not sure I have any useful answer to it. So a lot of the work on Monte Carlo tree search and computer science is grappling with this in some ways. Peter Dayan has some recent RL work that's working on this. The way we've actually approached it, for what it's worth, in this paper that I mentioned by Payam Pare, is not by doing that at all. It's by using an approximation. The issue is basically that the Bellman equation has max at every step. And so it's that max that's basically hiding things from you. And it turns out if you use a softmax approximation, you can actually get a pretty good answer in one step, even to the series of a whole bunch of maxes. And so there's a way to sort of skirt the whole problem, we think, which makes its own predictions, but that's sort of where we're going with that.
I let other people come, but everybody, we need to read this Nature Human Behavior paper. And Nathaniel did not pay me for the advertisement. I'm just kidding.
Thanks, Antonio. So next up is Kyo.
Hi, fantastic talk. Thank you very much. So I was wondering, so if I ever want to learn or plan how to, for example, how to go from Pasadena, California to Princeton, where the reward is, I'm not sure if I need entire sequence of the path. I probably skip many steps because, you know, I take Uber and go to LAX and then check in my bag and so forth. There's so many things that are not necessary. It's just so deterministic. And I guess the Yunzi's task is exactly that. I guess this the sequence was deterministic. There's 3 stimuli that leads to a final state. So I was wondering if you have seen those skipped replay and that influenced the choice.
Yeah. So it is still, let's see. So there's a few different, again, one aspect there is that, you know, you can plan at multiple scales and options and temporal abstraction actually intersects with the previous discussion we were just having, that the sequences then end up, you know, giving you sort of negative transfer, confusing you, but that's not what you're asking today. What you're asking today is that in this task, ABC, you see 3 stimuli, but actually 2 of them don't matter, and you could skip right from A to X or whatever. I don't believe, I don't believe that he separately estimates AX in his sequential. I don't think that's one of the pairs that he's counting, so as to test the sort of hypothesis you have. Although it's a good idea, I don't think that's been done. We worried about whether any of this would work because of this, and there's a lot of, so the way that people are trained and so on, they're taught the sequences before they do any of the task, and they're sort of drilled on them, and so there was an attempt to sort of make sure they really think of them as units where you actually have sequential activity, because it's important, for instance, for distinguishing forward and backward, to actually see the individual links, and that's one of the reasons we have series of 3 things and not just one, as we've used in other experiments. So that's not a complete answer, but it's a good question. And again, I think something that would be easier to investigate in something like a rodent preparation, where you have less noisy kind of direct access to the individual trajectories.
Great, thank you, Kyo. Ian.
Hi, Nathaniel. Thanks for the great talk. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the cost of doing these replays of these simulations. For instance, is it competition between different branches, different paths, or is there something like a minimum threshold above which we say it's sort of worth doing that replay? For instance, if you had only in your last experiment, if you had only one non-local branch, but let's say it was only a 5% chance of going there, would the decision maker, consider it worth it to bother doing the replay there?
So that's a great question. I mean, we don't have any direct data on this, but one of the nice things about this theory, actually, even compared to other ones, so first of all, there could be actual, calorie costs or something of spiking all these neurons and so on. So we're only assuming opportunity cost, as it were. But of course, it's entirely possible that these events are costly in some resource, right? But one nice thing about this theory is that EVB is in units of dollars and cents. It's really like how much more reward will I earn if I do this versus if I don't. And if you assume that this event takes a certain amount of time, then you really do just have a sort of direct threshold, which is given by what's your discount factor. And this is in this second paper I cited somewhere by Mayank, which is when is replay valuable? What should that threshold be? You can actually compare. It comes down to, I expect that I'll be able to earn, $10 more discounted if I think for a minute versus not. And then as the question is a minute and otherwise, but I take the sort of discounting hit for that minute, is the discounted value of waiting a minute worth, $10? And so there's a sort of opportunity cost of time question or a discounting question, and you can just write it down directly in those terms. And that's how we've thought about it. But this is a complete, that's just an idea, right?
Just a quick follow up to that. I mean, do you think working memory constraints could come in here? So if you had like a 7 or 8 branch version of your last task, would there just be some branches that just wouldn't be bothered with because they just?
Yeah. I think that's interesting too. What can I say about that? I mean, there's a distinction, which I think is part of what you're getting at. If you only think about one thing at a time, but you have to hold in mind the answers to all. If I there's a memory constraint in terms of, if I think about one thing at a time, I still have to compare them at the end or keep track of the best one I've seen or whatever. And so as you explore, people tend to talk about replay happening sequentially as though that were the only problem. But if you do a lot of it, you've got to aggregate them in some way or compare them. And so that imposes potentially a working memory constraint if you think of those as being held in working memory. We're kind of imagining that it drives the same kind of dopamine, basal ganglia, synaptic strength changes that you would have gotten anyway, so that it wouldn't necessarily require working memory at that level. But it does take time. I mean, I think that's, but I mean, I could certainly buy the other thing as well. It's an interesting thought.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm going to take prerogative to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll finish with Doug. So one thing I wanted to push a little bit is, to what extent do you think the mechanisms you've describe the family of strategies going all the way from full model-based control to kind of like what we might describe as pure habits? To what extent habits are, as you were saying, basically just deciding I'm not going to do replay, I'm not going to plan at all, or could there be something qualitatively different about habits? And really what you're talking about is within the model-based system, how you decide to compute value.
Yeah, and is there a model-based system, and is there a habit system? I mean, I think
it's effectively, this is it's a one system model that you're.
This is a one system model, although it's got sort of two mechanisms, right? So I think it does sort of interpolate, but it is kind of by design, although this is a strong, and this I think relates to what we were just discussing with Ian as well. If you assume that it's really bottoming out in the same dopamine basal ganglia kind of learning circuitry and affecting the same synapses, that does assume a sort of coupling between, there aren't sort of two separate sets of values, right? And whereas if you imagine that it's actually bottoming out in working memory or something, then there are. And I could certainly believe the latter, although that's not how we've set it up. There is some evidence, that these replay events in hippocampus are associated with stuff happening in dopamine and striatum. It's not great evidence, I think, but there's some. And this also makes the interesting prediction that merely deliberating about something should actually make it habitual, right? It should actually train up it's not just that I figure out some chess value and hold it in working memory. It's actually I'm training up habits in the same way overtraining with behavior would. That's a strong and interesting and testable hypothesis that we haven't done.
It's called learning.
Yeah, I guess so. Sorry, what's called what?
It's what we do when we teach students, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Like where people are drilling basketball shots in their heads and stuff. It's not completely crazy, I think. But But then there's also the question of whether there's one habit mechanism, like the people that think that there's a separate policy learning system that's completely Hebbian that just records actions and doesn't care about rewards, and whether that's sort of Uber habits, and those are different from theoretically from basal ganglia habits. I don't know. I think it's complicated. I don't think that probably either habits or model based are a single thing anyway. So reducing it to a one system model is not, is only going to capture a piece of it.
And just one other question is, in the kind of situation that you're looking at, or also the experiments that you've looked at, the animal experiments, I guess the animal essentially knows the model, right? It's kind of like a really trivial maze that it's navigating through. It's got very experienced with it. What do you think, happens in the situation where the model is not known, or is, there's a lot of uncertainty about how you navigate through the environment? How does that impact on, say, these trade-offs?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch to say about that as well. And it comes back to something someone said, was it Harrison? I can't remember, earlier, about whether it really creates novel sequences or it only replays. So the underlying mechanism of feeding simulated trajectories to a RL system to push value around is pretty flexible, right? You could do it with replaying the actual trajectories you've taken. You could sort of piece together things to create new trajectories you've never seen before. You could build a model and sample from them. All that you need is, state transitions that are plausible. You just need the ability to learn that state action, state pairs, right? And exactly where those come from, and may come from differently in different stages of learning and so on. I think on the one hand, there's some, I think you have in mind, and I have in mind something like your experiment with Lee, where you sort of scramble up the sequential contingencies, and that makes the model itself less reliable or something.
Yeah, I'm also just thinking that, the trade-off, say, between model-based and model-free, it isn't always the case that, model-based is better, because there are situations where if you have a poor model of the world, model-based RL actually does really badly. So I just, how that would impact on your model. Yeah,
I mean, I think to some extent, when you're thinking hippocampus, you might really be thinking of the model as totally rooted in experience, right? It's really experience replay. And to the extent it's constructive, it's because it's piecing together chunks of experience. So it's really all about memory retrieval. But yes, that could be a copy model. And it certainly can't do really, it can't play chess, right? You need somewhat more complicated reasoning to project forward how moving a knight in a novel chessboard affects the state of the game and stuff, right? So yes, it's an interesting question. It demands further thought.
Thank you, Nathaniel. So let's finish up with last question from Doug, and then we'll conclude the session.
Hi, thanks for coming back to me. So my last question was with respect to your gain term. Unless I missed something, I believe you said running these simulations would only be useful if it would change your behavior from what you would have done prior to running a simulation. So is that just for simplicity that you model it that way? Or do you actually believe that, like, for example, I would say that, you may think you know an answer, but if you have a low confidence in that versus a high confidence, you may be more likely to run some simulations just to boost your confidence that you're doing the right thing, even if it actually doesn't end up changing what you would have done a priori.
I could believe what you're saying as a psychological thing, and this, I mean, there's a bunch of caveats about this, but in general, I guess I would defend the idea that if you're thinking about the value of information, or the value of information, or the value of computation, what it does for you, if it does anything, is it helps you make better choices. If it doesn't change your behavior, it's going to take time without changing the outcome. And so in terms of the way we're setting up the objective, we really are saying that you shouldn't, overthink yourself about things that are not likely to change your mind and actually earn you more reward. But that's maybe somewhat of a formal claim, and maybe you're right that psychologically there's one detail in we actually do use softmax exploration inside our model, and so becoming more confident actually does help you make the choice more often. So we actually do get replay, just sort of less of it in the circumstance you're talking about. And it's a sort of generalization of the idea, which is that it's not just choice isn't just discrete. As you figure out better and better what the right thing to do is, you get more and more deterministic in doing it, and that actually does help you earn more money. So maybe that's the better answer to your question, just in terms of how it actually plays out. But I do think the intuition that, thinking is cheap, and what it, at the end of the day, what it's good for is action. I'm willing to stand up for that.
Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks again, Nathaniel, for a great talk, and thanks to everybody for all your questions and for this very great discussion that we've had. So I would like to say goodbye to everybody, and I guess, Antonio, the next talk is
2 weeks from now.
2 weeks from now. Great. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That was great. Thanks indeed.